Chapter 1 Mockingbird Players. I was in my late 20s and about to start my fourth year at the Southern Prisoners Defense Committee, SPDC, when I met Walter McMillan. His case was one of the many I was trying frantically to keep up with. After all, a crisis was growing. Alabama had no public defender system, which meant that many death row prisoners didn't have lawyers to represent them. My friend Ava Ansley was at an Alabama prison project to track cases and match lawyers to prisoners. In 1988, we got federal funding to create a legal center that could represent people on death row. I'd already worked on lots of death penalty cases in several southern states, sometimes winning a stay, which puts a stop to an execution, just minutes before an electrocution was scheduled. When I'd last visited death row, I met with 5 desperate condemned men: Willie Tabb, Vernon Madison, Jesse Morrison, Harry Nix, and Walter McMillan. The most memorable thing about Walter was how insistent he was that he'd been wrongly convicted. "Mr. Bryan, I know it may not matter to you, but it's important to me that you know that I'm innocent and didn't do what they said I did. Not no kind of way," he told me in a meeting room. His voice was level, but laced with emotion. I nodded. I had learned to accept what clients tell me until the facts suggested something else. I'm sure I'm not the first person on death row to tell you that they're innocent, but I really need you to believe me. My life has been ruined. This lie they put me on is more than I can bear, and if I don't get help from someone who believes me, his lip began to quiver, and he clenched his fists to stop himself from crying. "I'm sorry. I know you'll do everything you can to help me," he said, his voice quieter. My instinct was to comfort him. His pain seemed so sincere. There wasn't much I could do, but I reassured him that I would look at everything carefully. Back at the office, I went through the mound of records until I found the transcripts from Walter McMillan's trial. The trial had been short. I started reading. Walter McMillan was at least 15 years older than me, not particularly well educated, and he hailed from a small rural community. Though he had lived in Monroe County his whole life, he had never heard of the author Harper Lee, also a Monroeville, Alabama native, on her award-winning novel To Kill a Mockingbird. Mockingbird tells the story of an innocent black man who was accused of raping a white woman in the 1930s, and is bravely defended by Atticus Finch, a white lawyer. What is often overlooked is that the black man falsely accused in the story was not successfully defended by Atticus. Tom Robinson, the wrongly accused black defendant, is found guilty. Later he dies, when, full of despair, he makes a desperate attempt to escape from prison. He is shot 17 times in the back by his captors. While the novel captivated millions of readers and confronted them with some of the realities of race and justice in the South, its harder truth did not take root. Walter McMillan, like the character Tom Robinson, grew up in one of the several poor black settlements outside of Monroeville, where he worked the fields with his family before he was old enough to attend school. Educational opportunities for black children in the 1950s were limited, but Walter's mother got him to the dilapidated colored school for a couple of years when he was young. By the time he was 8 or 9, though, he became too valuable for plowing, planting, and picking cotton to justify the remote advantages of continuing school. Some backstory about Walter's hometown. Monroe County has been developed by plantation owners in the 19th century for the production of cotton. The fertile, rich black soil of the area attracted white settlers from the Carolinas, who amassed plantations and a huge slave population. Even decades after the Civil War and emancipation, the African American population toiled in the fields of the Black Belt as sharecroppers and tenant farmers depend on white landowners for survival. By the 1950s, small cotton farming was replaced with timber farming as Alabama's thriving industry. White landowners opened pulp and paper mills across the region. Acres and acres of land were converted to growing pine trees for paper mills and industrial uses. Times were changing, for better and for worse. African Americans, largely excluded from this new paper industry, found themselves confronting new economic challenges, even as they won basic civil rights. The brutal era of sharecropping and Jim Crow was ending, but what followed was persistent unemployment and worsening poverty. The region's counties remained some of the poorest in America. Walter started his own pulpwood business in the 1970s. He smartly and bravely borrowed money to buy his own power saw, tractor, and pulpwood truck. By the 1980s, he had developed a solid business and didn't make much extra money, but afforded him something else he valued: independence. If he worked at the mill or the factory, the kind of job that most poor Black Alabamans worked, it would mean working for white business owners and dealing with the racial stress that implied in 1970s and 1980s Alabama. Walter couldn't escape the reality of racism, but having his own business gave him a flexibility that many African Americans did not enjoy. Walter's independence won him respect and admiration, but it also sparked contempt and suspicion. His freedom was, to some of the white people in town, well beyond what African Americans with limited education could achieve through legitimate means. Still, he was pleasant, respectful, generous, and accommodating, which made him well liked by the people, Black or white, with whom he did business. Like anyone, Walter had his flaws. Though he and his wife, Minnie, had 3 children, it was well known that he was romantically involved with other women. Tree work is notoriously demanding and dangerous. With few ordinary comforts in his life, the attention of women was something Walter did not easily resist. There was something about his rugged exterior, his long bushy hair and uneven beard, combined with his generous and charming nature, that attracted the attention of some women. Walter grew up understanding that it was forbidden for a Black woman to be intimate with a white woman. He didn't initially think much of the flirtations of Karen Kelly, a young white woman he'd met at the Waffle House where he ate breakfast. She was attractive, but he didn't take her too seriously. When her flirtations became more explicit, Walter hesitated, and then he persuaded himself that no one would know. After a few weeks, it became clear that his relationship with Karen was trouble. She was younger and married. As word got around that there were 2 friends, she seemed to take a mischievous pride in her intimacy with Walter. When her husband Joe found out, things quickly turned ugly. Karen and Joe had been unhappy and were already planning to divorce. Now, Joe was threatening to take custody of their children and to disgrace her by exposing her relationship with a Black man. Soon enough, Walter received a subpoena summoning him to testify at a hearing about the Kellys' custody battle. He knew it was going to cause him some serious problems. Nervously, he went to the courthouse. When Walter took the stand, the lawyer for Joe Kelly's husband asked him crude, hostile questions. Walter wanted to forget about the whole ordeal, but word of the interracial affair spread quickly, and his reputation shifted. No longer the hardworking pulpwood man, known to white people almost exclusively for what he could do with a saw in the pine trees, Walter now represented something more threatening in their eyes. Fears of interracial sex and marriage have deep roots in the United States. In the aftermath of slavery, the creation of the system of racial hierarchy and segregation was largely designed to prevent relationships like Walter and Karen's. In fact, interracial relationships were legally prohibited anti-miscegenation statutes. The word miscegenation came into use in the 1860s when supporters of slavery coined the term to promote the fear of interracial sex and marriage and the race mixing that would result if slavery was abolished. For over a century, many Southern law enforcement officials saw it as part of their duty to punish Black men who had been intimate with their white women. The federal government had promised racial equality to freed former slaves during the short period of Reconstruction. But after federal troops left Alabama in the 1870s, white supremacy swiftly returned, and a series of racially restrictive laws enforced the subordination of African Americans. Voting rights were taken away, interracial sex and marriage were criminalized, and states throughout the South used the anti-miscegenation laws to justify the forced sterilization of poor and minority women. Forbidding sex between white women and Black men became an intense preoccupation throughout the South. In 1882, the Alabama Supreme Court reviewed a case regarding an affair between Tony Pace, an African-American man, and Mary Cox, a white woman. Both received prison terms. The following year, the United States Supreme Court reviewed the Alabama court's decision using separate but equal language, just as the Plessy v. Ferguson case would 20 years later. The court unanimously upheld Alabama's ban on interracial sex and marriage. Following the court's decision, many southern and Midwestern states passed racial integrity laws that made it illegal for African Americans and white and sometimes Native Americans and Asian Americans to marry or have sex with white people. It wasn't until 1967 that the U.S. Supreme Court finally struck down anti-miscegenation statutes in Loving v. Virginia, but restrictions on interracial marriage persisted even after the landmark ruling. It was only in 2000 that the issue got on Alabama's statewide ballot, where a majority of voters chose to eliminate the ban, although 41% still voted to keep it. Occasionally drinking too much, getting into a fight, or even having an extramarital affair, these slip-ups weren't significant enough to destroy the reputation of standing of an honest and industrious black man. But interracial dating, particularly with a married white woman, was, for many whites, a transgression in its own unique category of danger. With correspondingly extreme punishments, hundreds of black men have been lynched for even unsubstantiated suggestions of such intimacy. Walter may not have known the legal history, but like every black man in Alabama, he knew deep in his bones the perils of interracial romance for black men. Nearly a dozen people have been lynched in Monroe County, and dozens of additional lynchings have taken place in neighboring counties. These lynchings were acts of terror, inspiring fear that any encounter with a white person, any social misstep, any unintended slight, any ill-advised look or comment could trigger a gruesome, even deadly attack. Walter heard his parents and relatives talking about lynchings when he was a young child. When he was 12, the bottle of Russell Charlie, a black man from Monroe County, who was reputed to have an interracial romance, was found hanging from a tree in Vredenburg, Alabama. Walter remembered well the terror that shot through the black community in Monroe County when Charlie's lifeless, bullet-ridden body was found swinging in a tree. And now it seemed to Walter that everyone in Monroe County was talking about his own relationship with Karen Kelly. It worried him in a way that few things ever had. A few weeks later, an even more unthinkable act shocked Monroeville. In the late morning of November 1st, 1986, Rhonda Morrison, a white 18-year-old college student and beautiful young daughter of a respected local family, was found shot dead on the floor of Monroe Cleaners, the shop where she had worked. Murder was uncommon in Monroeville. The death of young Rhonda was a crime unlike anything the community has ever experienced. She was popular, an only child, and the kind of girl whom the entire white community embraced as a daughter. The police initially believed that no one from the community, black or white, could have done something so horrific. They pursued two Latino men who had been spotted in Monroeville looking for work the day Rhonda Morrison's body was found. Police tracked the suspects down in Florida, but found that they could not have committed the murder. The former owners of the Cleaners, an old white man named Miles Jackson, fell under suspicion, but there was no evidence that pointed to him as a killer. The current owner of the Cleaners, Rick Blair, was questioned but considered an unlikely suspect. Within a few weeks, the police had tapped out on their leads. People in Monroe County began to whisper about the incompetence of the police. Why couldn't they even find a suspect? People murmured. Tom Tate was elected the new county sheriff days after the murder took place, and folks started to question whether he was up to the job. After all, a murderer was on the loose. Meanwhile, Walter was wrestling with his own problems. He had been trying to end his relationship with Karen Kelly. The child custody proceedings, the public scandal, had taken a toll on her. She had started using drugs and seemed to fall apart. She began to associate with Ralph Myers, a white man with a badly disfigured face and lengthy criminal record. The relationship with Myers brought Karen to rock bottom. Together they became involved in dealing drugs. They were also implicated in another surprising crime, the murder of Vicki Lynn Pittman, a young woman from neighboring Escambia County. While the death of Vicki Pittman was news, it failed to compare with the continuing mystery surrounding the death of Rhonda Morrison. Vicky came from a poor white family, several of whose members were incarcerated. It was as if her lower social standing caused her life and her death to be seen as less valuable as Rhonda Morrison's. Police quickly concluded that Ralph Myers had been involved in the Pittman murder. When the police interrogated him, they encountered a man as psychologically complicated as he was physically scarred. Emotional and frail, Ralph craved attention. His skills lay in manipulation and misdirection. He believed that everything he said had to be epic, shocking, and elaborate. As a child living in foster care, he had been horribly burned in a fire. The burns so scarred and disfigured his face and neck that he needed multiple surgeries to regain basic functioning. He'd grown used to strangers staring and whistling at his scars. He was a tragic outcast who lived on the margins. So he tried to compensate by pretending to have inside knowledge about all sorts of mysteries. Myers eventually admitted that he may have played an accidental role in Pittman's death, but quickly put the blame for the murder itself on others. The more he talked, the less believable his story sounded. Officials began to suspect that Myers was the only killer and was desperately trying to cover his tracks. Ralph Myers was illiterate, but he knew it was the Morrison crime that was preoccupying investigators. He changed his story again. This time, he told investigators that he had been involved in the murder of Vicki Pittman, along with Karen Kelly and her black boyfriend, Walter McMillan. But that wasn't all. He also told the police that McMillan was responsible for the murder of Rhonda Morrison, too. That assertion got the attention of law enforcement officers who were eager to pin the murder on someone. To see whether Ralph Myers and Walter McMillan were actually in cahoots, an ABI, Alabama Bureau of Investigation, agent asked Myers to meet McMillan at a store. Agents would monitor the encounter, watching from afar. The test would be whether the two men recognized each other. Once Myers entered the store, he was not able to identify Walter McMillan. He had to ask the owner of the store to point Mr. McMillan out. Then he delivered a note to Mr. McMillan, supposedly written by Karen Kelly. According to the witness, Walter seemed confused both by Myers, a man he had never seen before, and the note itself. Walter threw the note away and went back to what he was doing. He paid little attention to the whole odd encounter. The ABI agents were left with plenty of evidence indicating that the two men had never met, let alone committed murders together. Still, they persisted that the McMillan theory, time was passing, 7 months now, and the community was fearful and angry. They desperately needed an arrest. Monroe County Sheriff Tom Tate did not have much law enforcement experience. Now, 4 months into his term as sheriff, he faced a seemingly unsolvable murder and intense public pressure, but there was no evidence against Mr. McMillan. No evidence except that he was an African-American man involved in an adulterous interracial affair, which meant he was reckless and possibly dangerous. Even if he had no prior criminal history and a good reputation, maybe that was evidence enough.